The first thing I noticed was the voicemail. Not the content of it. I never heard the content. What I noticed was the way my wife, Diane, walked into the kitchen, glanced at her phone screen, and immediately turned and walked back down the hallway toward the bedroom. Door closed. Quiet. I stood at the stove with a spatula in my hand and told myself it was nothing. That was the beginning of it, I think. Not the affair. I didn't know about that yet. Just that small, specific chill that settles somewhere between your shoulder blades when you know something is off, but you can't name it yet. Like a sound you almost heard. Diane and I had been married 11 years. We met when I was 31, at a property management conference in Denver. She was working in commercial real estate at the time. I was managing operations for a mid-size logistics company based out of Columbus, Ohio. We were the kind of couple that other people called solid. Stable. We had a 4-bedroom house in Westerville, a joint savings account, 2 cars paid off, and a decent amount invested in a brokerage account we'd built together over the years. No kids. That had been a decision we made together in year 3, revisited a few times, and then quietly set aside. I was 43. I thought I knew what my life looked like. After the voicemail incident, I started paying attention in that careful, deliberate way that feels a little like holding your breath. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't rifling through her purse or reading her texts. I was just watching. The way you watch a weather system coming in from the west, and you're not sure yet if it'll blow through or if you need to board up the windows. 3 things happened over the following 6 weeks that I couldn't explain away. The first was the phone. Diane had always been relaxed about her phone. She'd leave it on the kitchen counter for hours, set it down on the coffee table while we watched TV, hand it to me to look something up when she was driving. Then, sometime in October, that changed. The phone was always in her hand or in her pocket. She'd changed the passcode, and I only noticed because I tried to use it one afternoon when mine was charging, and it didn't work. I didn't say anything. I handed it back and said my battery was dead and I'd just wait. The second thing was the financial account. I check our joint account about once a week, not obsessively, just a habit from years of managing a budget. First week of November, I noticed a withdrawal I didn't recognize. Not enormous. $800 cash from an ATM near her office on a Tuesday afternoon. Then, 2 weeks later, another one. $1,200. I looked back through the history and found 2 more I'd missed in September, both in the $600 to $800 range. I sat with that. I told myself there were explanations. Maybe she was paying someone back. Maybe she was saving up for something she wanted to surprise me with. I am not someone who likes to lie to himself, and I knew by the end of that week that I was lying to myself. The third thing was the schedule. Diane's job in commercial real estate meant her hours had always been variable. Evening showings, weekend open houses, occasional dinner meetings with clients. None of that was new. What was new was that the explanations started getting thinner. She'd come home at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, and when I asked how the client meeting went, there'd be this slight pause, almost imperceptible, before she said, "Fine, long, I'm tired," and then she'd go upstairs to shower and I wouldn't see her until morning. I started writing things down. Not in any dramatic sense, just a notes app on my phone, timestamps and observations. The phone call she stepped outside to take on a Saturday morning when she thought I was still asleep. The weekend she said she was visiting her college friend Jess in Cincinnati, and I knew, because Jess had texted me 2 months earlier, asking if we wanted to come to her daughter's birthday party, that Jess had moved to Portland in August. I didn't confront her. I know that sounds strange. I've thought about it a lot since then, why I didn't just ask her directly. Part of it was that I needed to know what I was dealing with before I said anything. Part of it was that I'd watched my father go through a divorce when I was 22. Messy, emotionally driven, reactive, and he'd made decisions in the heat of it that cost him for years afterward. I didn't want to be that. I wanted to understand the full shape of the thing before I moved. So I called a friend of mine named Tom Kirby, who's a family law attorney in Columbus. I'd known Tom since college. I didn't go through his office formally. I just asked if he'd have lunch with me. We met at a place on High Street, and I laid it out for him. Everything I'd noticed. The account withdrawals, the changed phone, the schedule discrepancies. I told him I didn't know for certain what was happening, but I wanted to understand what my position would look like if what I was afraid of was actually true. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The most important thing you can do right now is not react. Know what you have, document everything, and don't make any large financial moves without talking to me first." I asked him if I could open a separate brokerage account, not to hide anything, but to move some of my premarital assets that I'd rolled into our joint investment account years ago. There were certain funds that had originated from an inheritance I'd received from my grandfather before we married. About $40,000 at the time, which had grown significantly over the 11 years. Tom told me that premarital assets with clear documentation could potentially be protected, but that it depended on how they'd been commingled over time. He told me to pull together whatever records I had and he'd look at them. He also said very clearly, don't do anything that looks like you're trying to conceal marital assets. That will work against you. I went home that afternoon and started pulling records. Thanksgiving came and went. Diane and I went to her parents' house in Cleveland, which was, in hindsight, a performance we were both putting on. She was warm to me around her family, relaxed in the way she hadn't been at home for months. I watched her laugh at something her brother said and thought, for a second, that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd constructed something out of coincidences and anxiety. Then, on the drive home, her phone buzzed on the center console and she picked it up and read the message and put the phone face down in her lap, and the look on her face before she smoothed it back to neutral. That look lasted maybe 2 seconds. But I saw it. I didn't say anything. I drove the rest of the way home. The following week I received confirmation I hadn't asked for. I was home on a Wednesday afternoon. I sometimes work from home, which Diane knew, but she forgot, or assumed I'd be out. She called me around 2 o'clock, not unusual. We talked for about 90 seconds about what to have for dinner. After we hung up, I realized I'd left my work laptop in my car and went through the garage to get it. As I came back through the side door, I could hear her on the phone again. She must have called someone immediately after we hung up. She was in the living room and I stopped in the hallway and stood very still. I only heard her side of it. Her voice was low but clear. She said something like, "He doesn't suspect anything." Then a pause. Then, I know. I just need a few more weeks. The timing has to be right. I stood in that hallway for a long time after she hung up. I didn't go into the living room. I went back through the garage, sat in my car, and called Tom. Tom told me to stay calm. I told him I wasn't panicked, I was just processing. He said, "Good, because now we need to be very deliberate." Over the next 2 weeks, Tom and I worked through my premarital asset documentation. I'd been thorough when we got married. My grandfather's estate had gone through probate and everything was on paper. Tom felt confident that a portion of our current investment account could be traced back to those original funds with reasonable clarity. He advised me to open a separate individual account and begin the process of documenting which funds had premarital origins, not as a concealment strategy, but as a protective one. Everything done above board, nothing hidden, all of it properly labeled in the account documentation. I also, and this part I'll admit was a little more deliberate, created a spreadsheet. I'd read somewhere years ago about someone who'd done something like this, and I'd filed it in the back of my mind without thinking I'd ever use it. What I did was create a file on my computer, labeled clearly, sitting in a folder on the desktop called Home Office, that contained a projected investment summary. The numbers in it were real in the sense that they reflected genuine account activity and historical growth rates. But the projection itself was aggressive, very aggressive. It took our actual brokerage holdings and applied a hypothetical return scenario that made the portfolio look significantly larger than it was. Roughly 3 times the actual current value, based on a rate of return we had never come close to achieving and had no realistic basis to expect. It wasn't a lie, exactly. Investment projections aren't promises. You can find prospectuses from legitimate financial firms with growth scenarios that make your eyes water. I labeled the document clearly as a hypothetical growth projection, scenario analysis. I put it in a folder on my desktop alongside real account statements, real tax documents, real mortgage paperwork. And then I made sure I used my home office computer, the one that sat on the desk in the 3rd bedroom, at least once a day while Diane was home. I wasn't hiding it. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I wasn't hiding the document. I was working at that desk regularly, as I always had. The folder was visible on the desktop. I never said a word about it to Diane, never pointed at it, never referenced it in conversation. I just worked at my desk and left the computer on when I stepped away to get coffee or use the bathroom. Tom knew what I was doing. He said, "I'm going to pretend you didn't tell me that." Then he paused and said, "Just make sure the label is accurate and you haven't fabricated any real account numbers." I hadn't. The week before Christmas, Diane told me she was going to visit her friend Sandra in Indianapolis for 3 days. I looked up Sandra Vickers, who Diane had mentioned a few times over the years as a college acquaintance. Sandra did appear to live in Indianapolis. Whether Diane was actually going there, I had no way to verify. What I did notice was that she packed more carefully than usual, and that she was, for those 3 days, oddly peaceful. When she came back on the Sunday, she hugged me at the door in a way that felt, I don't know how to say this, conclusive, like a period at the end of a sentence. 3 days after Christmas, Tom called me. He said, I think you should know I was at a holiday thing on Friday and I ran into Jeff Albright. Jeff Albright was a real estate attorney who occasionally overlapped with Tom's work. Tom said Jeff had mentioned offhandedly that he'd been retained on a family law matter recently. Tom said Jeff was being careful, obviously, not to say anything specific, but Tom said he knew Jeff well enough to read between the lines. I knew what that meant. I told Tom to get me ready. January came in cold and gray, the way Ohio Januaries always do. Diane and I moved through the house like we always had. Dinners together, TV in the evenings, weekend errands. It was the most functional we'd seemed in months, and I understood by that point that it was because she had a plan. People with plans are calmer. People who know how things are going to go can afford to be patient. I was being patient too. The shift happened on a Tuesday in the second week of January. I was working at my home office desk when I heard Diane come upstairs. She worked from home that day, and I thought I heard her stop outside the door of the office, which was slightly open. I glanced up. She wasn't in the doorway. But a few minutes later, I stepped out to get water and heard her door close quickly. I didn't react. I went to the kitchen, got my water, went back to the desk. 2 days later, she came home from work and was quiet through dinner. After, she did something she almost never did. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the living room alone for about an hour. I could see her from where I was sitting in the adjacent room. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't watching anything. She was just sitting there with her wine glass, looking at the middle distance. The next morning she was fine, cheerful, even. Made coffee, asked about my schedule, kissed me on the cheek before she left. I texted Tom. I think she looked. He texted back. Be ready. She filed on a Friday afternoon in late January. Her attorney, Jeff Albright, confirmed, had drafted the petition. Tom called me about 40 minutes after she was served because she'd apparently tried to reach Tom's office first, wanting to speak with me through counsel, which told me she wanted this to go quickly. I called Tom back and said I understood and to proceed. The negotiation process took about 6 weeks. Diane had retained Jeff under what I can only describe as an optimistic fee arrangement. She was clearly expecting a settlement that would justify the cost. What emerged over the course of those 6 weeks, as our respective attorneys exchanged documentation, was that the hypothetical growth projection she had apparently been using to estimate her expected share of the marital estate was not reflective of reality. When Jeff first submitted their proposed settlement figure, Tom sent me the number, and I sat with it for a long moment. It was substantial. It was based on an assumption of assets that simply did not exist. Tom responded with our actual, documented account valuations, the real brokerage statements, the real balances, the premarital asset documentation. Jeff apparently came back twice asking for additional documentation, seemingly convinced there was an account or a fund that hadn't been disclosed. Tom provided everything. Everything was disclosed. Everything was transparent. There was no hidden money. There was only the number on a clearly labeled hypothetical projection in a folder on a desktop. I was not present for the settlement conference. Tom was. He called me afterward. He said it had been quiet. Diane had been composed, but the composure had a kind of deflated quality to it. Jeff had pushed on the brokerage account discrepancy, and Tom had produced the full paper trail. The original premarital inheritance documentation, the account history, the growth records, all of it. The hypothetical projection, when Tom pointed to it during the discussion, had been labeled accurately. There was nothing improper about its existence. What was improper, Tom said with a straight face, was any assumption that a document labeled scenario analysis represented confirmed account holdings. Jeff had no real counter to that. The settlement was fair by any legal standard. I didn't try to leave Diane with nothing. That wasn't the point, and it never had been. What I protected was what could legitimately be protected. The premarital funds, properly documented, were separated. The marital assets were divided according to Ohio law. It wasn't the number she'd been expecting, but it was a defensible, reasonable outcome. What I found out afterward, not from Tom, and not from anything I'd done to discover it, came through Diane's sister Kristen, who called me about 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Kristen and I had always been close, closer in some ways than Diane and I had been in the last year of our marriage. And she called, I think, because she felt bad and wanted me to know the full picture. The man Diane had been involved with, She told me his name was Grant, that he worked in finance, that he and Diane had met at an industry event in the spring, had apparently been very interested in the divorce proceedings, specifically in what Diane might walk away with. Kristen told me carefully that in the weeks after the settlement was finalized, Grant had become considerably less available. By the time Diane had moved into a rental in Bexley, Grant had apparently stopped returning her calls altogether. I didn't feel vindicated by that, exactly, or maybe I did a little. It's hard to be entirely honest about something like that. What I felt, more than anything, was the particular clarity that comes when a chapter you've been dreading is finally over. Like the morning after a long storm, the world is quiet and there's some damage and you have to deal with it, but at least you can see what's in front of you again. I stayed in the house for about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. Then I sold it. It was too much space for one person and the mortgage payment wasn't hard to handle, but the rooms felt different when it was just me in them. I bought a smaller place in a neighborhood I'd always liked, closer to work, with a yard that needed less upkeep. I still talk to Tom, occasionally for professional reasons, mostly just because he's a good friend and he handled everything with more steadiness than I had any right to expect. I don't have any dramatic wisdom to offer about marriage or betrayal. What I'll say is this: the impulse, when you realize what's happening, is to react, to confront, to do something big and loud that matches the size of what you're feeling. I understand that impulse completely. I felt it standing in that hallway listening to my wife plan the end of our life together. But reaction when the stakes are financial and legal and 10 years deep is exactly what the other side is counting on. They want you off balance. They want you angry and emotional and moving fast. Because people who are angry and moving fast make mistakes. I moved slowly. I listened. I documented. I got a good lawyer before I needed one rather than after. And when the moment came, there was nothing for anyone to grab onto. Nothing fabricated, nothing concealed, nothing that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. Just the records I'd kept and a clearly labeled spreadsheet that someone had drawn their own conclusions from. That someone had to live with those conclusions. I didn't have to do anything at all.